Over the years, the canonicity of the FNAF books has sparked a lot of discussion, and with Secret of the Mimic on the horizon, that conversation has only gotten more intense. Some argue that the books align exactly with the games, possibly taking place sometime after the events of FNAF 6. Others see them as more of an in-universe fanfiction. And then there are those who think that the books simply parallel the games, not existing in the same continuity and only really serving to give us hints on the game's story. Now there isn't a single clear answer here, but by looking at what the books show us and comparing that with the games, we can try to piece together a better understanding of how, or if, it all fits. Now, before we dig into the real meat and potatoes, we need to talk about the Silver Eyes trilogy. While the story itself isn't the main focus today, it did lay the foundation for how many fans approach the books. The trilogy isn't considered canon to the games, but that doesn't mean it's completely irrelevant. Elements from it, like characters and events, occasionally bled into the games. For example, the name William Afton first appeared in the Silver Eyes before the release of Sister Location. Many expected the same idea to carry over to future book releases. However, this would first be thrown into question when in a Steam post before the release of Fazbear Frights, Scott said the series will have, quote, unique characters and plotlines, some connected directly to the games and some not. At the time, this sparked some intrigue in the fandom. Since then, it's led to possibly the biggest debate of the entire franchise, and likely the eventual cause of the Third World War. This, of course, leads us to the million-dollar question. Are the books just parallels to the games, or are they something more? Now, while I could go story by story through Fazbear Frights and Tales from the Pizzaplex, I don't think we really need to. What matters more are the stories that sparked the most debate and left a real impact on the community. So, with that out of the way, let's start where a lot of this began. A rabbit thing, a bloody ball pit, and the subscribe button. Let's go.
This is the place for you and your friends. This is the place where the party never ends. It's a good time place.
Now, if you somehow aren't familiar with the story of Into the Pit, I'll give a brief summary. Into the Pit is the story of a young boy named Oswald who begrudgingly spends his days at Jeff's Pizza while his parents are at work. He stumbles into an old ball pit one day and decides that there's literally nothing better to do, so he jumps in. However, upon entering it, Oswald, heavy quotes here, time travels back to 1985. He finds himself in a much livelier version of the pizzeria where the animatronics work, the kids are happy, and everything's a little too good to be true. He meets two new friends, Chip and Mike, and they have a great time before Oswald returns through the pit and back to present-day Jeff's Pizza. All seems fine, until he goes back one too many times. Oswald excitedly goes into the pit and thus back to Freddy's. A more animalistic Spring Bonnie attempts to lead Oswald into a party room, where Oswald sees an amount of victims. Oswald escapes through the pit again, landing back in the arms of his dad, who of course has no idea what just happened and scolds him for crawling around in an old nasty ball pit. Then suddenly, the golden rabbit emerges, drags Oswald's dad into the pit. See what I did there? The rabbit crawls out, takes Oswald by the arm, and drags him out of Jeff's. From this point onward, it assumes the role of Oswald's father, and Oswald's the only person that really sees it for what it is. Everyone else sees it as Oswald's dad. Oswald then decides that it's his responsibility to save his dad, so he returns to the pit. He does all this while constantly having to avoid the yellow thing. Eventually, Oswald does free his dad, and while they escape, the yellow thing tries to pursue, and somehow falls into the ropes above the pit and strangles itself. So Oswald and his dad have a bonding moment and live happily ever, traumatized forever after. Now, at first glance, that doesn't really seem confusing, it's pretty straightforward. But for some reason, this story has been retold 3 separate times. It was first released in Fazbear Frights as a short story, then again with the release of the game, Five Nights at Freddy's Into the Pit, and then retold one last time with the interactive novel Return to the Pit. Now, having multiple versions isn't that unusual, but here's the weird part. They don't all agree. Most notably, Return to the Pit changes the number of MCI victims from 6 to 5. A very deliberate shift. That alone is enough to raise some eyebrows. To have an interactive novel contradict a game adaptation of a Fazbear Frights story, a Stitchline story at that, seems very odd. So then the obvious question pops up. Which adaptation of Into the Pit, if any, is the canon one? The Frights story? The game? The interactive novel? Or a fourth, more mysterious option? Let's go ahead and tackle these in order. First and foremost, there's the Frights story. At the time it was new and cool, but nothing really special stood out until the release of the graphic novel adaptation, which is pretty much the same story, but it introduced us to the idea of 6 victims, which was kinda weird. Moving on to the game is where it gets tricky. Since it is a game, many would assume that it goes in the game's timeline. And while I see the logic, I don't really think that means anything. Normally when we refer to the game's timeline, we mean the original continuity that began with the classic FNAF games. That label exists because it originated with the games. When the Silver Eyes trilogy released, it was clearly separate, so we called it the book timeline. And later, when Fazbear Frights came out, we didn't just group it in with the previous books because all the stories and characters didn't align. We made a new distinction. Just because two entries share the same format, like being books or in this case games, doesn't mean that they share a continuity. We've already accepted this with the books, so is there a reason not to apply the same logic here? Then there's the interactive novel, which is once again a tricky situation, as it comes in a medium we would generally consider canon. VIP, The Week Before, and Escape the Pizzaplex are pretty widely accepted as games timeline, so why would Return to the Pit be treated any differently? Not to mention it also lines up better with our previous knowledge of the MCI. In Return to the Pit, there are only 5 victims. Still, the events of the story don't exactly line up one-to-one in the games. Why is that? Well, to answer that, I should probably give a bit of clarification on the ball pit time travel. It's heavily implied that the ball pit doesn't transfer you back in time. Rather, it sends you to a memory of that time, via agony. That's why the events are so different, like the animatronics malfunctioning before the bodies are stuffed, or the MCI being gathered in a party room rather than a safe room. The story isn't telling us how the events happened. It's telling us the trauma that these events left behind. It's not saying there was a massive kidnapping one day by a monstrous yellow rabbit. It's saying, remember those 5 kids that went missing, and the weird glitchy animatronics, and that one unsettling yellow rabbit? Now, on to our 4th and final mystery option. And the mystery 4th option is... all of them. Well, kinda. You see, there's a theory called pit loop, and it essentially states that all iterations of Into the Pit are canon, and that due to the agony ball pit situation, Oswald is reliving this same scenario over and over again. Now, there is a bit of evidence to support this idea. For one, it gives a reason on why this story has been retold so many times. It's not being retold. It's being relived over and over again by Oswald. Each iteration of Into the Pit is just another loop Oswald unknowingly falls into. There's also the fact that in the beginning of the story, Oswald is drawing Freddy's characters before ever knowing of their existence. He's having some sort of passive memory bleed through due to the past loops. One big piece of evidence that there's a loop happening is in the game. If you try to exit the pizzeria in the past, you get a bad ending. If you try to do the same thing on a new playthrough, Oswald simply says, "Nope, you saw what happened last time." Okay, so what about points against it? For one, while there is evidence that there is a loop happening, there's not much to support that the loop is across mediums. The details are different in each retelling, and while you could write that off as Agony just messing with perception, it seems odd to discount anything the others are trying to tell us. It also works similar to something like Dream Theory, where we use evidence to write off other evidence, and the overall lack of evidence is support for the theory. So with these options on the table, what's the correct one? Well, there's obviously no real solid answer. Not yet, at least. Personally, I lean towards the interactive novel, but this is one of those discussions that it's really hard not to see all sides. So how about we come back to this a little later in the video when I can give some more context. For now, let's move on to a story that's less ambiguous but caused just as much conversation. What We Found released in 2021, and it threw into question a ton of what we thought we knew about FNAF 3. While it was often thought we play as Michael, as it seems he is the main protagonist of the original story, What We Found puts a new character, Hudson, in the role. Before I go any further, I do want to give a brief summary for those who may be unfamiliar. What We Found begins by introducing us to Hudson. He is a deeply traumatized man whose father committed suicide, and his mother remarried to a man named Lewis, who would physically abuse him. This would cause him to fail his classes and cause nerve damage. At the end of his senior year, his house burned down, leading to the death of his mother and Lewis. With a history of physical abuse and nerve damage, Hudson struggles to hold a job until his childhood friends, Dwayne and Barry, convince him to apply at Fazbear's Fright while they prepare to enlist in the Navy. Failing the Navy physical due to his injuries, Hudson takes the attraction job full-time. One day, Hudson witnesses his friends bringing in a large coffin-sized crate, an animatronic salvaged from a hidden room in one of the old pizzerias. He refuses to look at it closely, but later decides to confront his fear. That night, Hudson examines the animatronic, who is pretty explicitly Springtrap, and is horrified to find that it's not just mechanical, but it has a rotting body inside. After a violent outburst, Hudson begins to hallucinate. He sees haunting visions of his childhood trauma, including memories of Lewis. From then on, Hudson is tormented by apparitions of his past and present. Springtrap stalks him and taunts him, and eventually an apparition of his father throws him across the room, causing his back to break. He tries to escape, but the entrance is blocked by plushies from the gift shop. Desperate, Hudson remembers his Granny Foster's advice: heat purges, fire heals. He hides inside an oven in the kitchen, reflecting on the night of the fire that ended Lewis's abuse, and how he accidentally set the house ablaze trying to protect himself. Now, in the oven, he hears his granny's voice once again, telling him his path is his own.
What was that? Oh, hey! Hey!
Realizing that the oven is turned on and he's trapped, Hudson begs for help. But no one comes. Cow a bummer. Now, if you were paying attention, you'll notice that this story can't neatly take place in game continuity, and luckily that's not really what the conversation about the story is. Some believe that Hudson in this story is simply paralleling a Hudson in the game. Since Hudson is the Fright Guard in this story, he would be the Fright Guard in the game, since the story is just a retelling of the game. In a way, this does make sense, considering that we know Fazbear Frights burns down at the end of FNAF 3 and Hudson's strong connection to fire in the story. That being said, that's all Hudson really has in his favor. First off, there's no real evidence that Hudson exists in the game continuity. The only support for him being the FNAF 3 guard comes from this Fright story itself. While this can be viewed as a retelling, retellings in this franchise don't imply having the same protagonist. For example, we know that in FNAF 1 we play as Michael Afton. However, in the movie Retelling, Mike Schmidt is a separate character, as far as we know. More importantly, even in the most generous timeline, it still doesn't align. We're explicitly told that Hudson is 23. If FNAF 3 takes place in 2015, that puts his birth year at 1992. That's already speculative since no game dates are confirmed, but we'll roll with it for argument's sake, meaning Hudson would have been a year old when the FNAF 1 location was up and running. But more importantly, he never encountered animatronics from the FNAF 2 location like Mangle or Balloon Boy or the Puppet, characters he quite noticeably doesn't see during the events of what we found. Now, you could argue that Hudson is just hallucinating based on the remains that he's seeing around the location, but that seems like a leap. There's no way that Hudson is seeing a puppet mask and just guessing what it looked like. There's also far stronger evidence supporting Michael Afton as the Fright Guard. In the survival logbook, Foxy is frequently used as a stand-in for Michael. We also know Michael uses the Foxy mask in FNAF 4. There's an illustration in the logbook of Foxy working as the Fright Guard himself. Given the context and symbolism, this feels less like a coincidence and more like a quiet confirmation. Without going into my own crackpot theories, I am fairly confident Michael is the Fright Guard. I've heard certain people say, what reason would what we found exist if it wasn't to tell us who the Fright Guard is? And to that I say, there's really no reason for like half the stories here to exist. They don't really tell us much about the lore, they're just there for the entertainment value, and I think that they're worth it for that. And secondly, we do learn something from what we found. We learned the nature of the phantom animatronics, which was a mystery back in the day, and it's been somewhat solved thanks to this story. So can we get a thank you what we found? Now that we're done with that, how about we move on to one last topic from Fazbear Frights? A collection of memories and stories. The Stitchline refers to a set of interconnected stories from Fazbear Frights, along with the reoccurring stingers found at the end of each book. These segments collectively form a larger narrative, and while not every story from the series ties in, there's a clear group that fits within this shared timeline. These include Into the Pit, To Be Beautiful, Count the Ways, Fetch, Out of Stock, 1:35 AM, Step Closer, The Man in Room 1280, Blackbird, The Real Jake, Hide and Seek, and of course, the Stitchwraith Stingers themselves. I'll give you a very quick, heavily abridged summary because trust me, we do not have time to go over all of these. A man lies in room 1280, his body burned beyond recognition yet still somehow alive. Scans show 2 brain signals, and he's locked in a coma trapped in an endless nightmare. Nurses try to end his suffering, but each time, a boy in an alligator mask appears and stops them. That man is William Afton. Eventually, a priest visits, and through vague signals, Afton requests to be taken to a nearby Fazbear warehouse. Once inside, naturally, Afton explodes. His agony-infused remains scatter across the facility, embedding into random objects. Cut to Jake, a young boy dying of a brain tumor. His mother is dead and his father is deployed in the military. His only companions are his caretaker Margie and a doll named Simon. Unbeknownst to Jake, Simon has a walkie-talkie inside, and it's actually his father talking to him. One day, the doll goes silent. His father has passed away. Before Margie can break the news, Jake passes too, but his soul lingers, attaching to the doll. Meanwhile, Dr. Phineas Taggart is experimenting with the idea that emotion, especially agony, can haunt objects. He combines a Fazbear battery, an old endoskeleton, and a doll mask to create a bizarre animatronic. This animatronic wakes up, kills Taggart in confusion, and escapes wearing a trench coat. This creature is the Stitchwraith. Inside it are two souls, the soul of Jake from the mask and Andrew from the battery. Andrew is the same vengeful spirit who is keeping Afton alive. The Stitchwraith begins tracking down all the haunted objects and dumping them into a trash compactor at the warehouse, hoping to contain Andrew's agony. Detective Larson is investigating a strange series of murders tied to these haunted objects. He eventually stumbles upon the Stitchwraith mid-disposal. Andrew takes over trying to attack Larson, but Jake stops him, throwing the Stitchwraith body into the trash compactor and turning it on. But something goes wrong. The pieces reassemble into a monstrous rabbit-shaped amalgamation. Andrew is nearly consumed, but Jake saves him, guiding his soul to peace and removing him from the plot. Larson, injured, hurls a puppet mask at the creature. The puppet awakens inside of it and tears it apart from within. Larson escapes, burned but alive. Jake, now the sole spirit in the Stitchwraith, finds him and cauterizes his wounds. Alright, from this point onward, the story gets pretty bad. 9 days later, Jake and the Stitchwraith is back at it, this time trying to help people. He rescues a girl named Renelle from some drug dealers and returns her to her home. But something feels off. Renelle's father turns out to be a scientist experimenting with the remnant, just like Taggart. Jake notices a photo of Renelle and she looks nothing like the girl that he helped. That's because our new Renelle is actually Eleanor, a mysterious antagonist who paralyzes Jake by breaking his battery and resumes the form of the scientist's daughter. Meanwhile, Scott Cawthon remembers that Larson exists, so he shows up at the house for plot reasons, collapses, and mumbles Eleanor to himself. Naturally, this sends him to memory purgatory. Jake somehow powers up again and fights Eleanor. She reveals that she was responsible for the haunted objects all along, undermining most of Andrew's plot relevancy. Jake absorbs Eleanor to stop her. Larson wakes up. Talbert, the scientist, presumably wonders why his house reeks of underdeveloped characters. Jake, having defeated Eleanor, backtracks to an old ball pit where Eleanor had essentially been storing her victims like an AFK agony farm. Jake makes it his mission to free these spirits. Later, Dr. Talbert gives Larson a pendant, explaining that Remnant is memory made manifest, capable of creating life, power, or horror. Once again, that was a heavily abridged summary, so we missed some details, but I think we covered the big things that I want to focus on. Let's start with the Andrew in the room. It's pretty clear that in the beginning, Andrew is essentially running a UCN-style torture loop on William. He's keeping him alive, keeping him suffering. That's exactly what's depicted in Ultimate Custom Night. So then the question arises, is this what UCN was really showing us? Was Andrew the vengeful spirit all along? The one you should not have killed? This feels a bit strange because it implies Afton killed a kid that we've never heard about in the games. Unless we have. Remember way earlier in the video when I mentioned that both the Into the Pit short story and the game reference 6 victims instead of 5? Some fans believe that that 6th victim is Andrew. If you think the Stitchline is canon, this interpretation makes a lot of sense. But then the interactive novel changes it back to 5 kids, which throws a wrench in the theory. So which one is canon? Well, this is where the divide sets in. Try and keep up because things are about to get really messy. There are generally 2 major camps in the fandom. One side argues that since these stories never explicitly contradict the games, they're part of the game's timeline. If that's true, then UCN might not be some abstract purgatory. It's a remnant-fueled torture loop orchestrated by a dead kid who wears a trench coat. The other side believes that that's not enough. Just not contradicting the games doesn't make them canon. They need to be reflected or proven in the games themselves. From that view, Cassidy is still the strongest candidate. Before we move on, let me throw in my personal take, so grain of salt or whatever. I think people are a little too quick to pick a side and treat it as canon, but I get it. The evidence is compelling whichever way you lean. Personally, I think these stories are meant to tell us something. Why go through all the effort to set them apart from the other Fazbear Frights stories if they're just parallels with no purpose? But at the same time, Cassidy and Golden Freddy have been built up for years. It would be kind of cheap to say, surprise, the vengeful spirit was this random kid that you couldn't have known existed until this book released. So, do I lean towards Cassidy being the vengeful spirit? Yes. Do I think it's also possible Andrew is the vengeful spirit? Also yes. Do I think it's good storytelling either way? No, not really. Now, I know what you're thinking, dear viewer. Oh, OmniSoap, this is an amazing video, and I did like, comment, and subscribe. But what does any of this have to do with Secret of the Mending? Well, let me tell you. Everything. Let's rewind to the end of the Stitchline. Remember that pendant that Larson receives? The one tied to Remnant? Some strange object passed on to him in a moment that feels important, well, a pendant with very similar properties shows up in the Tales from the Pizzaplex story, Frailty. This detail made a lot of people stop and think, could Fazbear Frights and Tales from the Pizzaplex be in the same continuity? Some fans were already leaning towards Tales being canon to the games, and if that's true, then Frights would come along for the ride. But of course, there was no solid proof. At the time, it was all speculation. Interesting coincidences, yes, but nothing conclusive. And then the story, The Mimic, released. Allow me to give one final summary. The story of The Mimic follows Edwin Murray, a down-on-his-luck inventor. His wife passed away during childbirth, leaving him to raise his son, David, alone. They live together in an old shoelace factory, the same place Edwin uses as a lab for his robotic projects. Not helping things is the fact that his robotics company was recently bought out by Fazbear Entertainment. Now, buried in deadlines, Edwin barely has time to care for his son. But then he has an idea. He works tirelessly on a machine designed to be a friend for David. He calls it Mimic. It's programmed to learn, copying David's motions and behaviors and remembering them for later. At first, it's a brilliant success. David is overjoyed to have a constant companion, and Edwin finally has time to breathe. The Mimic plays with David, studies him, and grows more refined. Edwin even begins thinking about how to profit from this breakthrough, maybe even enough to buy back his company. But then, tragedy strikes. While chasing a ball, David runs into the street and gets hit by a car. He dies instantly. Edwin is shattered. And when he sees the Mimic repeating David's gestures, those little pieces of his son now hollow and robotic, he snaps. In a blind fit of grief and rage, Edwin beats the Mimic nearly to pieces, pouring his anguish into every blow. 2 weeks later, a team from Fazbear Entertainment is sent to the factory to recover any useful assets. Edwin is nowhere to be found, and strangely, this is actually the second team to be dispatched. The first one vanished without a trace. The second team enters the factory, and they don't make it far before finding the remains of Team 1, because the Mimic never left, and worse, it learned. It remembers what Edwin did, and it's been dealing with intruders the same way Edwin dealt with it, with cold, mechanical brutality. Bodies are folded like laundry in the closet, bare parts tucked away in the fridge like leftovers. Now, on its own, this was a pretty cool story, but it seemed to have some connections with Security Breach. Then the Ruined DLC released, and the Mimic is just there. This really got people starting to speculate on the book's canonicity. A year and a half later, Help Wanted 2 released an update featuring David's tiger plushie and teasing Secret of the Mimic. This only added fuel to the fire, and that fire has had no sign of stopping until now. Within a little over 24 hours of this video's release, Secret of the Mimic also releases. We know we play as a Fazbear employee sent to recover Murray's work, implying that this may be a direct continuation of the short story. Although, there seem to be some inconsistencies with the books. In the trailer, the factory seems to be up and running, and the teasers for the game show us the Mimic in everyday objects. This seems odd considering we know Edwin disappears at the end of the story. Did he leave and come back, deciding to profit off of his creation, ignoring the bodies scattered around in his home and deciding to put his murderous programming into a coffee pot, then decide to leave again only to come back again, since we know in the books he shows up later in the story. Not to mention, the teasers all show a happy cartoon family, and it seems like these cartoons are trying to depict the Murrays. Only there's one issue. Edwin's wife, Fiona, dies during childbirth, meaning there is no happy family. When David is born, Fiona passes on. This evidence has led many to believe that the games will follow a similar but different storyline, still following Edwin's creation of the Mimic, just with some changes to fit in the game's continuity. This would outright deconfirm Tales games. Others still stick with Tales games, assuming that the game will address these new circumstances without contradicting the original story. If Secret of the Mimic releases and goes out of its way to fit in with the original story, then it essentially confirms Tales games. Now, regardless of what happens in Secret of the Mimic, I'm sure some will write off evidence that doesn't support their previously established understanding of the franchise. Still, for the first time, it seems like an end to this debate is in sight. When Secret of the Mimic releases, we will be infinitely closer to having a true answer than we are now. Allow me to end this video with one last quote from Scott Cawthon. This one's about 7 years old, but I still think it's a little important to keep in mind when we theorize in the modern day. If I make a game that contradicts one of your theories, it doesn't mean that my game is wrong. It means that your theory needs to evolve. Thank you for watching. Hey, if you're hearing this, that means you made it to the end of the video. Congrats! This is like my first proper YouTube video, so it means a lot that you watched all the way through. It's been like rough to get this video out. I'm actually recording this like 30 minutes before the video is supposed to go live, so that's cool. I want to give a huge shout out to Gary for voicing Hudson like way back when. I also want to give a big shout out to Cody, Shadow, and Felix for listening to me talk about making this video while I like consistently crash out over having a hard time editing. If you're in the old Discord, we just made a new one, so if you want to join that, feel free to. Link is in the description. I also stream on Twitch, which I do a lot more than this. Also, I never gave Secret of the Mimic predictions, so we'll play as a random guy. A character that had no lore significance before will now be like retroactively given it, so Balloon Boy, because why not? Oh, and the Secret of the Mimic will be
Connection terminated.